right, well, let's start officially. So my name is Andrew Miles. I'm currently at the University of Toronto. And I've been doing survey stuff for a long time, got into it as a graduate student, in large part because I needed to collect my own data. Existing surveys weren't doing it for me. And I got into the online aspect in particular because I was poor, as many graduate students are. And I've just sort of never looked back. It's been great. So let's dive in. Let me share my screen here, and I will get us moving. Okay. So first off, again, if you haven't picked up on this already, let me share my conviction that this course is going to be an awful lot of fun. I genuinely believe that the things we're going to talk about are extremely applicable in many corners of sort of the modern research environment. There's a little bit of something for everyone. So I'm excited that you're here. I think it will be a good time. The way we're going to run throughout our 4 days together is there'll be instruction and sort of content where I'll be demonstrating things interspersed with a couple of activities and live demonstrations. To the extent possible, I encourage you to follow along with the demonstration. Some of them will be easier to follow along with than others, just because of the nature of like the software that we'll be using. So I'll be using Qualtrics to do some survey design. So if you have Qualtrics or really any other survey software, I encourage you to try and follow along, right, as we do those demonstrations, and then you'll have opportunities, exercises where you can work on your own. And then some of the other stuff I'll be showing you, like places online where you can find samples, and you'll probably need an account, et cetera, et cetera. I'm assuming you don't have that, so those might be just be sort of sit back and watch types of things. All right, so let's dive in here. All right, just a quick overview of where we're going to be going in the course. There's really two major portions. A section on survey design, putting together our questionnaire, programming that survey into the software, avoiding some of the problems and mistakes that we might otherwise make, and trying to create our make it so that our data collection instrument is as well developed and likely to produce valid data as is humanly possible. We'll cover things ranging from, what makes for an effective question, how do you have your survey interact or not interact with your participants, visual design features, all of these types of things. And then we'll spend some time talking about samples. We're going to pay a lot of attention to online samples because they pair really, really well with online surveys. And I think in many respects, they are, at least for some researchers, a large untapped resource. And I think there's just a ton of potential there. So we'll talk about how to work with them, where to find them, some things we should be aware of, and how to do it ethically, responsibly, and in ways that preserve the quality of our data. And believe it or not, that's going to take us to the end of the course. However, when I was first developing this course, I just thought of some really, really cool things that someone who's using online or web-based surveys could do, especially if they're willing to use Respondent that they recruit online, and the way those two technologies pair really, really well together. And so I created a supplement. I originally wanted to do it in the course, but we just don't have time. So there's a supplement that you'll get after class on the 4th day. It's just a video that the Statistical Horizons and Code Horizons staff will email to you that talks about some ways of really maximizing the strengths of these web surveys and online samples to do things that I think are really quite remarkable. So look forward to that. That'll come after day 4. All right. Now I'm going to dive into the content. Okay, let's do it. So I'm going to begin with a basic overview of some orienting concepts, and then we're going to dive in heavily to designing those surveys. So let's first begin by talking about surveys generally. Survey, like I like to define it as really any format through which you get to ask people questions. Questions are sort of the workhorse of surveys. And traditionally, we've had lots and lots of different types of surveys. Well, not lots and lots. We've sort of had three main contenders here. You could call people up on the telephone, ask them questions. You could sit down with them. You usually show up at the door and say, "Hey, can I find a time to sit down and ask you some questions?" And then we've had paper and pencil surveys, often delivered through the mail, where you want people to fill these out and return them to you. Now, there's been some technological advancements over the years that allowed you to, for instance, have a computer help you with your telephone survey. They call those computer-assisted telephone interviews. But the important point for us is that a whole lot of research went into figuring out the differences between these types of surveys and how to get the highest quality data using these surveys, right? So they would ask questions like, how does, the mode of the survey, whether I'm using a telephone versus a face-to-face survey, does that affect the answers that people give? And in some cases, the answer is yes, right? So having somebody sit down in front of you sometimes produces different responses than if you are answering more or less anonymously. And then they would ask questions about different design decisions, right? Well, my paper and pencil survey, if I squish these questions together in a particular way versus spread them out, do I get different answers? And they would pay a lot of attention to things like response rates. Are there certain things that I do that get people to not take the survey or more people to take the survey? What's the quality of the data like, etc. Now, some things changed and some things stayed more or less the same with the advent of the internet. First of all, we started seeing lots of other types of surveys, right? Surveys that you could, come in over your email, app-based surveys more recently, surveys hosted on a website, lots and lots of different types of surveys. Now, the nice thing is that these web-based or online surveys, I'll use those terms interchangeably, they have a lot in common with these paper and pencil surveys. And what that means is that many of the hard-earned lessons that we have acquired over the years from these paper and pencil surveys, they translate really well to online environments and to these online surveys, right? Because there's a lot of stuff that's the same, right? You have respondents who are on their own reading questions, having to interpret the questions on their own, etc. But of course, computers are different than paper. Computers are different than sitting down and talking to someone. So there are, in some instances, new opportunities, but also new challenges that come along with that. So here's just a quick overview of what I think some of the advantages and challenges associated with these web-based surveys are. First of all, things that we learned from studying paper and pencil surveys about what makes for higher quality data, they're just so much easier to do when you use a web-based survey. Things like randomizing the order of your questions, having people skip from one question to another. I don't know if you've ever filled out, my guess is you have, right? Tax form or some sort of paper and pencil survey where they're like, if you answered, B, skip down to question 4. And then if you're lucky, they have like an arrow skipping you down. But if you don't, and you spend a lot of time thinking about it, and you're like, I'm not sure I did this right. Computers take that all away, right? You can make that completely painless for your respondents. We can also do things like include multimedia. The cost of adding a big color picture to a paper and pencil survey is quite a lot. To a computer, it's essentially nothing. Videos, sound clips, anything like that, we can stick it in our survey. Unlike a paper and pencil survey, and a little bit more like having someone sit down with an interviewer, you can actually get feedback and give feedback to respondents depending on what they do in the survey. And so we'll see some examples of that, right? So when people seem to be rushing through your survey, you can detect that and you can catch it and you can pop up a little reminder and say, hey, please stop that. And of course, one of the things that I think have made these web-based surveys so popular and have just the market for these things has really exploded is the fact that compared to all of the alternatives, they are easy to do. They are cheap. I mean, they're not no cost, right? But they're significantly cheaper. They, again, depending on who you sample, they can often be very fast. And collecting data is just significantly simpler than it used to be. One thing I'll add here to the end, which I don't actually have a bullet point for, but popped into my mind, so why not, is the fact that the amount of work that it is for you after the data are collected is often significantly lower with an online survey as well, simply because you're not having to process and digitize, paper and pencil questionnaires or things like that. It's actually all done for you if you've designed your survey well, and there's very little, and in some cases, no data cleaning that has to happen after you finish, which is pretty awesome. Challenges. They're on computers. Not everybody is comfortable with computers. Now, this is becoming less of a challenge as time goes on, but this is still sometimes an issue. The computer industry has lots of different products out there. People have their computers configured in lots of different ways. And so one thing that you need to be aware of is that sometimes what you think is a survey that's working perfectly well on your computer might not work quite as well on different operating systems or on different computers that may or may not have the same software or hardware installed as you do. So you have to be aware of these things. Again, pre-test is the name of the game. We'll talk more about pre-testing later, but it's important enough that I'll plug it now. Pre-test to make sure that your survey actually does what you think it should do across lots of different types of devices. And this is only magnified by the fact that people can now access the internet in so many different ways, on tablets, on phones, even on watches to a certain degree. All right, so in this course, again, we're going to really be focusing on a particular and I think very popular type of survey, which are these web-based or online surveys. These tend to be taken in a browser, and they're administered on some sort of online platform like Qualtrics or SurveyMonkey. They're, again, Zoho, right? There are a number of different survey administrators, right? What that means is we're not going to be paying a lot of attention to things like surveys you might give to someone in a custom-made application that goes on their smartphone, surveys that you might give to them over their, via the email where they actually fill it out in the email, etc. Though that said, those are significantly less common and I think less popular than the sorts of surveys that we'll be discussing. Incidentally, that's also where the research is, right? In discussing these web-based or online surveys. All right, quick conceptual distinction here that I think is very important. When you hear something like web-based survey or online survey, that can actually be a little bit ambiguous depending on the context, because it's not always clear whether you're talking about the format of distribution, right, the actual survey instrument, or where you're getting your respondents from, right? So if someone talks about an online survey, are they talking about the fact that it's taken on the computer? Are they talking about the fact that the people who are taking their survey are people that they found online, both, etc.? So the important distinction here is that these are not the same thing, and we will treat them separately in this class. And if you're not already there, you should get in the habit of thinking of these things separately. So just to give you an example, your survey mode or format are things like, do I give them the survey over the telephone, on a piece of paper, through a browser, etc.? Whereas the sample is just who ends up taking your survey. So for instance, you might have a web-based survey, and you could distribute a link to that survey to students in a single class. I do this all the time, incidentally, because the university approved, like the official course evaluation surveys are practically useless to me. So I developed my own, right, that are about my own class, and I give them to every one of my, all of my students. But again, it's a web-based survey, but it only goes to students in my class. So in that sense, I sort of have the entire population that I'm interested in right there in my room. It could go to company employees, or it could go to something like a more traditional, nationally representative type of sample where you've probabilistically sampled addresses in a particular country, and then you want them to take a web-based survey. So the sample is different than the survey mode. Perhaps less common, but also possible. Perhaps you go online and you find people who are on an online forum, you find online gamers or something, but you're really interested in getting in-depth qualitative information. You want to understand how they see and experience the world, what it's like in the online gaming community, etc. You might not want to do a web-based survey. You might want to get their email address, schedule times to have an interview, maybe an in-person interview, maybe an interview over the computer. You might send them a paper and pencil survey. You might call them up on the phone, etc. Now, again, I don't want to beat this point to death, but it's important, right? Because your ability to get valid data and the sort of inferences you're going to be able to make from your data is going to depend both on the survey mode and the sample that you get, right? So both of these things will affect your data quality. And that, of course, not of course for you, right? But of course for me, leads us into this concept called total survey area, total survey error. And the basic idea here is this. How do we know if we have a good survey, right? A good survey is one that gets us the right answer or close to the right answer. And this total survey error framework, Paul Beamer describes it briefly here. He's a survey researcher, but it's basically the acknowledgement that there are lots and lots of things that go into the process of data collection, data, post-processing, data analysis, that can help us get the right answer or not get the right answer. And now this framework has been used for a long time with other surveys, and it extends pretty naturally to web-based surveys. So to give you an example, which is also a quick review from all of our, hopefully you're not getting, negative flashbacks to your first statistics course. But the idea here underlying this total survey error and this orienting framework is the assumption that there is some population that we want to understand. It could be as large as all of the residents in a country, could just be students at a university. Maybe you're in a company and you want all of your current customers or potential customers. Again, it could be anybody, right? But the idea is that you've defined some sort of population, and at least in theory, you can imagine getting everyone that you're interested in your population, asking them a question and getting exactly the right answer, right? This is our population parameter. And this is what we want to know, right? When we have, for instance, potential customers for a product, we want to know, hey, are they interested in this product? Now, in reality, we can almost never get everyone that we're interested in our population. So we have to draw some sort of sample. And there are a number of different ways that we can draw those samples. There's probability-based sampling methods. There's snowball sampling. There's let's post a link and see if anybody comes and takes my survey sampling methods, right? There's just all sorts of different ways of sampling. Once we have the sample, we then have to collect data from them in some sort of way. These are things like our survey instrument or whatever it is that we're doing. And then once we have data, we have to analyze the data. And it's only after that entire process has completed that we get our estimate of what we want to know. And we hope that they match, right? They usually don't match exactly. And the difference between the two is the error, how much we're wrong by. And our goal, of course, is to minimize that error. In fact, essentially everything we're going to talk about in the course is about how do we minimize that error so that even though we don't know perfectly whether we got exactly the right answer, we can at least be confident that if the right answer is out there to be had, we're as close as humanly possible. Now, again, this total survey error framework, what it's really trying to remind us, right? For our purposes, really the only reason we need to pay attention to this is the fact that there are many things that contribute to that error. How we sample, how we collect the data, how we analyze the data, etc. Now, again, in our class, we're really going to be focusing a bit on sampling method. Again, don't worry, this is not a class on sampling, but we're going to talk about samples, the sort of samples you get online, how those can affect our estimates, how we can correct those estimates, and so on. And then, again, we'll spend a lot of time talking about collecting data. How do we make good surveys? All right. Now, there are two general classes of errors that survey researchers pay attention to. So I'm going to introduce these basic ideas and the terminology because we're going to use it a lot. First are what they call errors of non-observation, right? These are essentially issues of how representative your sample is, right? So this is all the ways that we can get things wrong because certain types of people never make it into our sample. So we have like a coverage error where, again, some members of the population are not in the sampling frame. This might be, people in your company, if you're interested in surveying your company, or employees in your company who don't have an email address on file or have an incorrect email address on file. So when you send an invitation to the survey, simply don't have a chance to take it. And then there are people who do get sampled. They do have a chance to respond, but they can't be bothered for whatever reason, right? That's a non-response error. Then we have errors of observation or generally measurement errors, right? These are all the things that can go wrong simply because something has affected the accuracy of the data that we've collected. In terms of our course, this errors of observation is really, we deal with that at the survey and questionnaire design phase. And this errors of non-observation, right? That's has to do with the people. How do we get people into our sample? What are the people like, et cetera? And we deal with those types of issues when we talk about sampling and online samples. Now, how is it the survey researchers actually go about figuring out how much error there is? A couple of key ideas and terms. First is this idea of survey non-response, right? These are people who don't even start your survey at all. And often this is easy to figure out, right? We know we sent emails to 1,000 different people and 500 people took the survey. We know that we've got about a 50% response rate. 50% of the people didn't start our survey. Then, of course, there are the people who start the survey, but they just don't answer particular questions. Then there are the people who start your survey and then just stop your survey completely. They stop answering all of the questions. We call that a survey break-off. And then there's just this sort of fuzzy category that I call differences across survey designs. And the basic idea here is if we look at two otherwise identical surveys and one of them, for instance, asks a question one way and the other one asks the question the other way, do the responses end up looking like each other? Do they have, for instance, the same mean, the same variation? Do people take longer answering one version of a question or another? And so on and so forth. So essentially, lots of different potential differences between surveys are things that survey researchers pay attention to. The general term for differences across different designs, survey designs, is a design effect. Generally, design effects, as well as non-response, break-offs, etc., these are considered to be bad things. Now, just because something is bad, though, doesn't necessarily tell you how bad it is. So obviously, we'd like to avoid all of these things, but given limitations in knowledge, right? We don't know everything about our respondents. Part of the reason we're giving them a survey. We don't have infinite amount of time. We don't have infinite amount of money. So sometimes we have to prioritize. So how bad are these different types of things? So what researchers investigate, I can't call them two different approaches, but two different things that they really pay attention to are, first of all, does this occur, right? Do we find survey non-response? Do we find differences across survey design? But also, how much does it actually matter if it does? And under what conditions does it matter if it does? And those types of questions can sometimes be very useful if we're pretty sure that we're going to be running into one of these types of errors, but maybe it doesn't matter, or maybe it only matters in a certain way. And if we know what that way is, then we know how to interpret our data out the other end. Just to give you a quick a quick idea of this, right? Obviously, we want everyone to take our survey, but if some people don't take our survey, if that survey non-response is completely random, right? There's no pattern to who's not taking our survey, which again, rarely is the case, but if there is genuinely no pattern, then it's not going to mess up the answers that we get in our data. We're not going to get biased estimates. Our standard errors, our regression models and things will be a little bit bigger simply because we have less information, but we can feel pretty good about the fact that we're probably still going to be getting close to the right answer. Okay, so let's talk about getting a good questionnaire. So here's the first thing I'd like you to do. Take a moment, look at this question, and then ask yourself, what are your impressions? What stands out? And go ahead and you're welcome to throw stuff in the chat, though I'd really prefer, if you don't mind, raise your hand, unmute, tell me about this survey. Yeah, Jamie.
Yeah, there was very little information of the kinds of questions that I would be asked, and there was a lot of variability in the kinds of questions that were asked in the survey.
Okay. Kirsten.
Yeah, a lot of different font stuff going on there.
Okay. And how do you feel about that font stuff? Is it warming your heart, or is it sort of jarring on your nerves, or?
It's making me think about like how I describe things that I like. So I'm like, well, maybe I would say like favorite, like with emphasis. Like maybe that's how I would describe it.
Okay.
I'm confused. I'm trying to like figure it out how I feel, but I'm a little confused.
All right. Correct me if I mispronounce your name. Gentiana?
Gentiana. Yeah, so I think I got your question correctly. I would say that it's not clear how the response options differ from each other. Like, I like it a lot. I love it. Well, you can say that I love it more than I like, but what's the difference between I like it a lot versus I love it? And there also, I think someone mentioned that there is variability in like the length of the response options. Like some are longer than the others, and that may kind of seems like they're not the same on the same scale, basically, the response options.
All right. Yeah. Any other impressions about this? Allison?
Yeah, I thought that some of the questions were not very clear in how they wanted you to answer it. So it kind of left it up to you to interpret it the way that you want it. And that kind of makes it hard for the people analyzing the data, because you're going to get a variation in the types of responses and you might not get what exactly you were intending. Okay, yeah. So there's some ambiguity about this where they might be interpreting different than you're interpreting, right? That can definitely be an issue. Anyone else want to take a stab at this? I'm not fishing for answers, incidentally, right? I'll tell you what I think in just a second. I'm just maybe I'll ask this question. By raise of DigiHand, how many like this question? How many think this is a good survey question? Oh, so Kirsten mentioned in the chat here, what if you don't like? What if you don't like this company? What do we do then? All right, so I see no DigiHand, so nobody thinks that this is a good survey question, or you fell asleep. I'm going to go with the first option because it makes me feel better in my heart. So here are a few thoughts about this question. This question is busy. Visually, it's very busy. There's lots of information competing for your attention. This graphic here seems to draw your eye, but it doesn't really do anything for the question. It's not particularly informative. And arguably, it's something that might subtly encourage you to give a favorable response, a favorable rating for this fake company limited. As you've noted, there's in fact no way to give a negative review of this company based on this question. Notice as well that from a text perspective, this information up here at the top, which actually is not relevant to answering the question at all, is much more prominent than the actual question, which is difficult to see because of the hideous color scheme. Yellow question on a bright red background. Don't do bright red backgrounds. Down here, how do we distinguish between I like it, I love it, etc., right? Again, you might feel that love it is better than like it. Favorite, I like it a lot, right? What do I do there? You might notice as well that we have check boxes, which if you've been on the internet for more than like a week, you know that check boxes suggest that you can select multiple options. And often when we're asking these sorts of questions, we actually want people to select a single option. So we've kind of screwed things up there. And then this down here, I like it a lot. Underlining also has a very particular meaning for anybody who's been on the internet for a little while. Is that a hyperlink? Can I click on that? And so on, right? So there are lots and lots of different problems with this question. Now, for our purposes, the important question is this. If I run a survey like this, how will these design decisions affect the quality of the data that I get? Are people going to give different answers because I chose to format my survey this way versus another way? Will my survey take longer than it otherwise would? Because people are squinting at the screen trying to read the questions. And will people even continue to take my survey at all? So these are the sorts of things that keep survey researchers up at night, right? They want to know the different design decisions. How does it matter? Does it matter? And to what extent does it matter? So what we're going to be moving into now, again, are just talking about all of these different types of things. Color and font and question writing and so on and so forth. We're going to start with a discussion of how to write good questions or how to find good questions, right? Save yourself a little trouble if you don't need to write them. Because questions are the core of any good survey. And then we're going to go on to sort of more of the programming side. Visually, what does my survey look like? How do I program it, etc. Now, let me note that good survey software will make your life a lot easier, because good survey software will take good design decisions and it will build them in as defaults. I had to work really hard actually to make this question look as bad as it looks. So I did this in Qualtrics because Qualtrics tends to have pretty good defaults for its surveys. However, while good survey software can take you a lot of the way to where you want to go, you should note that people who produce survey software, they are not driven only by research on what it makes for effective surveys. The big companies, the good companies, SurveyMonkey, Qualtrics, possibly some others, those ones I'm most familiar with, they have people who are trained survey researchers who work for them. But they're also trying to market to businesses and other companies. And so if businesses think they want certain things, even if those things have no added value or perhaps even cause problems for data quality, then it's in their interest to provide those things just so that they can stay competitive in the market. So the companies themselves, I would say, find good survey software, but don't trust them 100%, right? And how will you know where to trust them and where not to trust them and what makes for good survey software? Well, you're taking this class. We're going to talk about the principles of effective design, and then you'll be able to compare, right? You'll be able to look around and say, does it seem to match up, right? Is this good survey design? Okay. So questionnaire. We're going to spend a fair bit of time about writing the questionnaire, and there are a couple of reasons for this. First of all, questionnaires really are the core of your survey. Almost everything else we do is trying to get people to be able to access and use appropriately our questionnaire. Or if I can put this more bluntly, if you don't have a solid questionnaire,
it doesn't matter how good anything else about your survey is. Your survey is dead in the water, right? You will not get good data. You will not get the information that you want. And in my experience, people underestimate how difficult it is to put together a good questionnaire. They don't realize how many different decisions that they make and can affect the quality of their data. In fact, I remember sitting down with one of my senior colleagues at some point. I forget why I was in the room. They might have invited me, which would make what I'm about to tell you seem less awkward, right? But I was looking over their questionnaire, and they were, showing me the different questions. And someone who's been, doing research for a long time, and their questionnaire had problems. And once you learn the principles of good design, you'll start to see these problems in lots of different places. Now, again, as I said before, we have a lot of research about what makes for effective question writing. A lot of that has been done on paper and pencil surveys, and it translates almost wholesale. So what I'm going to do in this section of the course is I'm just going to give you kind of the distilled accumulated wisdom from that body of research. I'm not going to actually go back into the research because I think that's not the best use of our time, but we'll talk about the principles. We'll illustrate the principles to make sure that you understand them. And then we'll move on from there. Okay. So first, before you start putting any questions on the page, you need to ask yourself, how long does my survey need to be? And the answer is, particularly when you're doing a survey that's going to be distributed online, shorter is better. But how long is too long? There have been a couple of studies that have looked at this explicitly, and what they did is they actually just asked people. They said, hey, how long can these surveys be? Now, these studies come from Mexico and Germany. The recommendations that they give, I've seen sort of bandied about by different survey companies without making any sort of references. So I'm assuming they're using internal data. But they match up pretty well. Here's what people say. The ideal length for a survey is somewhere around 10 minutes. The max lengths that people say that they're really willing to tolerate is somewhere around 20 minutes. And they're just like, beyond that, just don't go there, right? We don't want to take a survey that's long. Now, if respondents like your survey, right, they'll give you another minute or two before they start getting antsy. But we should also note that there's a lot of unexplained variation across individuals. Some people just don't tolerate long surveys well. Some people, they'll sit there for a really long time. And there's actually still a lot we don't know about what gets people to sit down in front of surveys. And perhaps we never will, right? It seems reasonable for me to think that there's just always going to be a lot of individual level variation. Now, what that means for us as designers is we sort of have to play to the low middle, right? People who tolerate long surveys, it doesn't matter. We don't really need to worry about them. We need to worry about the people who are going to potentially drop out if our survey is too long. So shorter is better. Now, just to give you a sense for this, in terms of mobile devices, they did a meta-analysis a number of years ago looking at this, and people stop taking your survey if it ends up being too long. Now, patterns on mobile devices are almost certainly more severe than they would be if people are sitting down at a computer, simply because you can imagine all the different ways that mobile devices differ from these personal computers, up to and including the fact that they are mobile. And so people are more likely to get your survey invitation while they're waiting at the doctor's office. They start your survey, and then all of a sudden someone comes out and says, hey, the doctor will see you now. And so they just never get back to your survey. So there are probably a lot of different reasons. But given the ubiquity of mobile devices, we should be sensitive to that. Now, I will, just as a good place to note, I'm going to talk more specifically about mobile devices later. So we're going to be going over general recommendations that really apply to any sort of survey. I'll throw in a couple of little teasers about how mobile devices differ, and then we'll spend some time on mobile devices in kind of a dedicated chunk later on. All right, a couple other things to keep in mind in terms of survey length. Now, the points made here are actually only based on a couple of studies, but I think the patterns make a lot of sense. Enough sense that I feel no hesitation in making these recommendations. So for instance, if people don't like taking long surveys and you tell them that your survey is going to be long, fewer people are going to start taking your survey. On the flip side, if you say, hey, my survey is real short, and then it's actually really long, people are going to get upset and they're going to stop taking your survey, right? So we're going to get higher break-off rates. Excuse me. Should also be aware that if you have longer surveys, data quality might go down towards the end of the survey. So these are things like when you ask people to like write out answers, they might give you shorter answers, they might skip more questions and so on. So for me, as a general rule, this suggests that no matter how long your survey is, put questions that are easier to answer at the end if you can. And these are things like demographic questions, perhaps other questions, right? So some things are just really, really easy for people to answer. It takes almost no effort for them. And so even if they're not trying, they'll probably still give you accurate information. But those at the end, just in case. Now, again, talking about mobile devices, surveys take longer, generally speaking, on mobile devices. So if you're going to be collecting data on both personal computers and mobile devices, planned based on the mobile device length. And generally speaking, these days, if you're doing something online, you should probably assume that you're going to get mobile devices unless you specifically choose to block them. And there are valid reasons for doing that. I've done that on a number of different studies just because of what's the content of the study. But if it's just kind of a basic survey, you're going to want to keep those mobile devices in there, but that also means you're probably going to have to keep your survey a bit shorter. Now, here's a quick plug. Do you remember right at the beginning I said there's all this great material that doesn't fit in the course, so I made a little video supplement. You'll get that after day 4. If you're in a situation where you really do need a lot more content and your survey would be 20-30 minutes long, something like that, I would say take a look at that video. There are some ideas in there about how to get more content into your survey without necessarily making your survey that much longer. Just as a quick teaser, there are ways of doing planned missing data designs where you ask some of the questions only to some of the respondents. That will allow you to get more content onto your survey, and then you can collect data over time, right? Again, one of the great things about these web-based surveys is they tend to be very easy to distribute. And as soon as people respond to the survey, you have the data. And so things that would be just absolutely onerous if you're doing it through the mail or with a face-to-face interview are often not that bad. And sometimes as easy as simply sending out another email. So breaking your survey up into a couple of different surveys. Again, there's some potential problems with that. People might not respond to all of your surveys, but that can also keep your survey length short. Okay. So we know we don't have room for everything we might like to ask. So we're going to start assembling our survey questionnaire. The first thing you should always ask yourself is, do I actually need to write these questions myself, or are there questions out there already that I can use? There are a couple of reasons why you might not actually need to write those questions yourselves. A great one is somebody has already actually written and then preferably validated that a question measures what you're interested in. There are a number of great reasons for using validated questions, besides the fact that, they're just easy, right? You know that the question is valid, for instance. This hurts my heart a little bit to say, but sometimes people have written questions that are not amazing, but they're probably okay. They're good enough, and people use them all over the place. I just recently had a survey where we are using some measures that other people had written up. These people had clearly not taken my class or any class on survey design, but they
this measure was extremely widely used. And so I put a little note to my RAs in the corner. I said, look, what I had originally done is corrected their response scale to make it align better to good survey design principles, but I actually changed it back because I wanted it to be more comparable with what was already in the literature. And I figured this is probably good enough. And I wrote a little note off to the side. I said, this is a terrible design, but we're going to do it anyway. Sometimes that's just what you got to do. Now, you might want to write a survey question if there isn't somebody who's asked about what you want to ask about, or the existing questions are so bad that you need to start from scratch. Okay, quick note. Nowhere on the screen right now is a suggestion to write a question just because you think it's going to be easier than going and searching out validated questions. Writing questions is harder than you think. And good questions have been validated. So if you write a question, there's always this chance that maybe it's not measuring exactly what you think it's measuring. Maybe it's not being understood the same way by everyone who's taking your survey. Do we know that the response scale is appropriate, et cetera, et cetera? In fact, I'll have a fun example later on. Fun if it wasn't so so unfortunate, of a time when people developed a scale that came to be widely used and was used for like 20 or 30 years before they realized that people were understanding the questions in the survey differently, and it was exaggerating relationships in the data, and had been doing it for 20, 30 years, right? So again, that's coming on later. So validated questions are really important. So step one, where do you go to find these questions? A couple of different places. The academic literature, certainly in some fields more than others, will publish papers, right, where they validate and show you and try and convince you that the scale that they've come up with actually measures what it's supposed to measure. So if you can find those, that's ideal, right? You both get the measure and you get the ammunition that you need to talk to, higher ups or reviewers on your manuscripts or whoever it is, to let them know that this is a good measure. Another good place to look is major surveys. Look what kinds of questions they ask. This gives us a couple of different advantages, one of which is you have a question that is comparable to a major survey, but also because major surveys tend to be large, have a lot of people involved, and tend to be very expensive. And so you can hope that they have done their homework to make sure that their questions are good, right? Because they're spending a lot of money. And so they have a strong incentive to do that. And many of these surveys have been going for years, right? These are things like the General Social Survey, the American National Election Study, World Value Survey. Those are the ones that I'm most familiar with, but there are lots of others. And you probably know what they are for your field. And of course, you can just use the internet, search up a survey question maker, survey question repository. A couple that I found from the Centers for Disease Control in the United States, a bunch of health questions. They list a lot of the questions that they've used. Pew is a big public polling firm. They share the questions that they use. And this down here is sort of fun because this is actually a website that has a list of other question banks. So there's lots and lots of question banks available. So take some time, look around, and see if there are questions that they use, right, that you can reuse. Now, just because a question is posted doesn't necessarily mean it's a good question. Just because a feature is a default in survey software doesn't mean it's a good default. So you're going to want to apply the criteria that we discuss in this course as you read through the questions, so you can be selective, right? Pick the questions that are good, and just leave the questions that are not. So let's talk about writing or evaluating your questions. What are the principles involved? What we want to do is adopt what the literature calls a respondent-oriented approach. In other words, we want to get into the minds of
the respondents, the people who are going to be using our survey, and figure out what's going to help them provide accurate and useful information. And almost always, that means we need to be asking ourselves, how are respondents going to experience this question? And our goal is to then make it as easy as possible for them to get the right information to us. Get the right information to us. Sorry, felt like I had something else to say there, but and we make it easy. Again, easy is the name of the game here. So let me give you an example of how this seemingly simple principle sometimes is a bit harder in practice. So consider this question about purchases. How many times did you purchase non-food items during the past month? Now, on the surface, it seems like a perfectly fine question. And I think part of the reason why it seems like a perfectly fine question is because as people who speak English, we can read this question, we generally understand what it's talking about, and we interpret our fluency with understanding with it being a good question. That's part of the reason I think why it's so difficult to write good survey questions. It turns out fluency is not necessarily a good, or fluency in understanding is not necessarily a good metric to use in determining whether a question is actually going to do what you want it to do. A much better way of approaching this is to say, how would I answer this question? Now, a couple of things pop up for me as I look at this question. How many times did you purchase a non-food item? What is a non-food item? Right? Some things clearly are non-food items, like a couch. What about candy? Candy food? I mean, I certainly tell my children that it isn't, right? So are they talking, groceries, restaurants, right? And this idea of purchasing items are things. What about services, right? So if I ordered a service online, does that count as purchasing a non-food item? Or are we just talking about physical objects? So there's a little ambiguity as I start to actually get down into the nuts and bolts of what's going on here. And then what seems like something so innocuous, right, is actually potentially difficult. This text box allows people to type in a number that suggests that we want them to give an exact answer. However, giving an exact answer for a question like this would actually be very time consuming and potentially very cognitively demanding. I'm not even convinced that people would be able to do it. This is exacerbated by the fact that we have asked them to do this over the past month. So in order to actually do what we're asking them, respondents would have to sit down and think about all of the purchases that they've made over the past month, which ones are non-food items. They then have to categorize all of these different purchases. And then they have to provide an exact count. That's what we're asking them to do in this question. Again, I don't think people would be able to do that. Maybe if they kept receipts for everything they purchased over the last month, and they were willing to go get the receipts and pull them out, people aren't going to do that in your survey. So my guess is we're asking people to do something which they're not going to be able to do. And if they can't do what we're asking them to do, here's probably what they're going to do. They're either going to recognize that immediately, be a little bit annoyed and move on, or they will try and do what we've asked them to do, and it will be frustrating because they're not going to be able to do it. So then they'll get frustrated, give us some sort of answer or no answer at all, and then move on. Consider instead this version of the question, which again still isn't 100% perfect because no question is necessarily 100% perfect. But what's changed? Well, first of all, we've added all of this information here and changed the questionnaire in these different ways to make it easier for the respondent to provide an answer. So we say not how many times, but about how many times did you make a purchase? The about signals that we actually don't need something that's exact. That is a huge relief for a respondent. We're not asking about the past month, right? Because remembering purchase for the past month is hard. Past week makes that a little bit easier. And notice our response options. We're no longer asking for something that's exact. we're reinforcing the aboutness, so to speak, of our question by using categories, right? So now people only have to think as hard as it takes for them to be able to slot themselves into the right category. It's a much easier task for the respondent. Now, the downside, of course, is that we don't get exact purchasing information. But as I mentioned before, my guess is in this particular case, respondents actually aren't able to give us that kind of exact information anyway. So this might be the best that we can get. Notice that we've changed the language here to just make a purchase. We got rid of that weird item language, makes it a bit clearer. And we threw in a little phrase that can help people to think about all of the different types of purchases that they make. We're thinking both in person, sort of brick and mortar store purchases, but also online purchases. And then when we talk about excluding purchases of food, we give some examples, things like groceries or restaurants, right? Those examples were chosen because we think that for most people, those are going to be the major food purchases, or the most regular kinds of food purchases. And so we're trying to clue them in what we're talking about here. So again, rewriting the question has made the task significantly easier for respondents. We're likely to get much better data out the other end. So survey researchers have broken down the response or the process of responding to a survey question into sort of 4 different steps, right? The 4 different things that people have to be able to do in order to answer your question. First is they have to know what on earth you're talking about, right? They have to comprehend the question, preferably the same way that you do, so that the information they're giving you, you actually are able to interpret correctly. Once they know what you're asking them, then they have to get the right information, retrieve the right information, call it up from memory, etc. And then, again, depending on the type of question, sometimes that's actually, this next step is not really that big of a deal. Sometimes it is. They have to take that information and then they have to make some sort of judgment, right? So you ask somebody their opinion, they have to pull out the relevant information, and then they have to say, what is my opinion, right? They have to make a judgment. And then they actually have to provide the answer. They have to take that judgment that they came up with in their head, and they have to find a way of putting it onto your survey. And as I've said before, and I will probably say again, we want to make every single step as simple as possible for respondents. Keeps them happy. Also make sure that the data that we're getting is likely to be as high quality as possible.